Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's December 12th, and I'm back from an International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee meeting that took place last week in London. We have a lot to talk about today, but before we get too far into the podcast, I just want to share how humbling and inspiring it is to sit in a room with some of the very best neuroscientists in the world and just listen to their level of passion and commitment as we discuss research strategies and other issues related to unraveling the progressive MS riddle. It's been my honor to be a part of the Scientific Steering Committee for the past 2 years. And I experience this exact same reaction at every one of our meetings. It's just an extraordinary group of experts, and as someone whose family has been living with the full force impact of progressive MS, I know that there hasn't always been much in the way of good news for people living with progressive multiple sclerosis, and now that's changing, in large part because of the International Progressive MS Alliance and their global scientific attack on progressive MS. They aren't just talking about it, they're walking the talk, investing tens of millions of dollars in research that's designed to make a real difference. And if you want to learn more about the International Progressive MS Alliance, you should visit their website at www.progressivemsalliance.org. And if you're curious about how or why I have a seat on the Scientific Steering Committee, I'm happy to explain, because I think that explanation in itself says so much about how the Alliance works. From the beginning, the Alliance set up the Scientific Steering Committee to include non-scientific lay people who were living with MS in their lives. And after an extensive worldwide search, they selected 3 of us. And our role on the committee is to represent the perspectives and give voice to the priorities of families living with multiple sclerosis. I'm honored to share my responsibilities on the committee with Carolyn Sincock from Scotland, who lives with secondary progressive MS, and Alexis Donnelly from Ireland, who lives with primary progressive MS. We call ourselves the 3 MS-keteers, and I've seen firsthand how seriously my fellow MS-keteers take their responsibilities on the Scientific Steering Committee and how they add so much to our discussions. And by making us full voting members on this committee, I think the Alliance is really demonstrating their commitment to developing the kinds of treatments that will help solve the real-world challenges that families living with multiple sclerosis face every day. And while I was at our meeting, I had the opportunity to sit down for an interview with Professor Alan Thompson, the chair of the Scientific Steering Committee. But before we get to my conversation with Professor Thompson, a few other things happened this past week. We've all heard that an apple a day keeps the doctor away. Well, a study published by Johns Hopkins School of Medicine suggests that that may be especially true for people diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. The study looked at 7,000 people who had been diagnosed with MS for, on average, 20 years. All of these people had previously provided detailed dietary information for another research study, and when the researchers went back and looked at this dietary information, they found that within this group of 7,000 people, those people who had diets that included a high intake of fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, and a lower intake of red meat, processed meat, and added sugar from desserts or sugar-sweetened beverages, was 20% less likely to have severe physical disability or severe depression. Researchers also looked at lifestyle choices in this same study, and they found that a healthy lifestyle resulted in less depression, less fatigue, and less MS-related pain. And here, a healthy lifestyle means eating a healthy diet, exercising regularly, maintaining a normal weight, and not smoking. The study also looked at the effects of different popular diet plans, including the paleo diet, Wall's diet, Swank, the gluten-free diet, and a few more, and they found a slightly positive effect from these diets on disability. So this study seems to show some sort of relationship or association between lifestyle choices and MS. Because of the study's design, it doesn't show us how diet impacts MS disability. And just last week, we talked about a much smaller study that explained how diet choices seem to affect our gut bacteria. And there's been a lot of recent research that connects gut bacteria to multiple sclerosis, so it looks as though we're scientifically connecting more of the dots every day, and that our dietary choices and our lifestyle choices can make a real difference in how MS impacts us. So not to state the obvious, but eating healthy, exercising, and choosing not to smoke seem to be very good ideas. And while we're on the subject of stating the obvious, but maybe with more scientific certainty on our side, you might want to consider this study done by researchers at Liberty University College of Osteopathic Medicine. After analyzing data collected from patient records between 2004 and 2013, they concluded that MS patients who stay on their MS drug medication as prescribed stay healthier in the long run than those who don't. The researchers looked at electronic health records, insurance claims, and self-reported medication adherence and based their conclusion on the number of inpatient hospital admissions, emergency room visits, outpatient appointments, and healthcare costs. So of the 681 survey participants with multiple sclerosis, the patients who took their drug medication faithfully reported 14% less severe physical impact of MS and 17% less severe psychological impact than those patients who didn't always adhere to their medication schedule. The patients with the rigorous adherence to their medication schedule also reported a 12% decrease in their level of disability. Oh, and this is something that should come as no surprise to anyone who's taking MS drug therapy. The study also concluded that those patients who religiously followed their medication schedule had higher healthcare costs than those patients who didn't. And given the astronomical and constantly rising cost of MS drug treatment, that is absolutely no surprise. But if the outcome is less physical impact from MS, less psychological impact from MS, and less MS disability, this still sounds like a highly worthwhile investment. A study from the University of Bergen in Norway demonstrates that a simple blood test may someday replace the need for MRI scans to measure MS disease activity for people diagnosed with relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis. Researchers at the University of Bergen found that the blood levels of a factor called neurofilament light chain correlated very closely with the appearance of new brain lesions, and the levels of neurofilament light chain dropped once MS patients started drug treatment. Now, getting into a detailed discussion about neurofilament light chain will probably leave most of us scratching our heads, so I'll just say that it's a component of nerve cells, and I'll add that it's released from damaged neurons. And I don't really think we want to venture much past those damaged neurons for the purposes of this conversation. But one of the interesting things about this study is that it showed that blood levels of neurofilament light chain increased as new brain lesions appeared and decreased when drug treatment was started, but it didn't show a correlation between the levels of neurofilament light chain and relapses or disability. So this blood test may prove to be a really effective way to monitor disease activity and response to treatment without having to wait until there are symptoms or relapses to measure. But the finding is important. Obviously, when you compare it to an MRI scan, a blood test would be a far less expensive, far less invasive, and a much faster way to diagnose MS disease activity. There are actually numerous studies and clinical trials going on right now that are looking at neurofilament light chain as a possible biomarker for MS, and this is one more study that seems to strengthen the case for neurofilament light chain as a reliable factor for measuring disease activity in MS patients. So everyone who'd rather take a blood test than an MRI, please raise your hand. Thanks, I think I see you all. For the past couple of years, it feels like it's been hard to get through a day without hearing or reading something about self-driving cars. There isn't a major car company anywhere that isn't working on this technology, and both Uber and Lyft, the two leading ride-sharing companies on the planet, are already well into the testing phase, and each promises to have self-driving cars on the road and available to us within the next year or two. So with all this smart, driverless driving technology being developed, I've wondered when someone would apply or adapt that same technology to wheelchairs. Now, some people may ask, what's the point? Isn't a wheelchair already easy enough to use? But I think there is an important point to be made here. According to the National MS Society, about 1/3 of the people diagnosed with multiple sclerosis lose their ability to walk, either partially or completely. But MS brings with it lots of other symptoms too. And if your particular case of MS is compromising your vision, or causing tremor, or creating muscle fatigue, then operating a wheelchair isn't easy at all. Not even a power chair. In fact, sometimes it stops being an option altogether. So the idea of adapting so-called smart technology to mobility devices has always seemed to make sense to me. And now I'm happy to say that I'm not the only one. This past week, the Toyota Mobility Foundation and Nesta's Challenge Prize Center launched a $4 million challenge called the Mobility Unlimited Challenge. The Mobility Unlimited Challenge wants to improve life for people with lower limb paralysis by rewarding innovative solutions for personal mobility devices that incorporate intelligent systems ranging from artificial intelligence to exoskeletons and machine learning. The challenge is open to teams around the world who are interested in developing these kinds of technologies, and the way the challenge works is that awards worth $50,000 each will be given to 10 teams in April to develop their applications. Then on January 14th, 2019, judges will select 5 finalists from among these 10 teams, and each team of finalists will receive $500,000 to take their idea from concept to prototype. The ultimate challenge winner is going to be announced in Tokyo in September the year 2020, and that winning team will receive $1 million to bring its device to market. This concept of challenge awards is a great way to jumpstart innovation, and it's also a great way to reach out to smaller teams of inventors who may have amazing engineering ideas, but don't always have the resources to compete with larger, well-funded entities. This way, everyone gets to see how high their concept might fly. And the real winners, they're going to be the millions of people around the world who will directly benefit from better, smarter mobility devices. Team applications for the Mobility Unlimited Challenge are available online now, so let the games begin. The International Progressive MS Alliance doesn't just talk about progressive multiple sclerosis, they're doing something about it. Last year, the Alliance invested over $14 million in 3 research grants involving more than 40 researchers working from 21 institutions in 9 different countries around the world. And they aren't finished. They are committed to finding answers to progressive MS. In a moment, I'll be joined by a man on a serious mission, Professor Alan Thompson, chair of the Alliance's Scientific Steering Committee. Now, Professor Thompson and I sat down at a busy hotel in London last week, so I'll apologize in advance for a bit of background noise during our conversation. But I think it's a conversation you'll definitely want to hear. Today I'm speaking with Professor Alan Thompson, Dean of Faculty of Brain Sciences at University College London and Chair of the Scientific Steering Committee for the Progressive MS Alliance. Full disclosure, Professor Thompson and I know each other because I'm one of 3 lay members of the Scientific Steering Committee, and our role on that committee is to represent the interests and the perspectives of families around the world who are living with progressive MS, and I have to add that fulfilling my role, or at least trying to fulfill that role, is one of the most rewarding things it's been my honor to attempt to do. So welcome to the podcast, Professor Thompson, and thank you for taking a few minutes to talk with us.
It's my pleasure.
Since some of our listeners may not be as familiar with it as you and I, can you explain what the Progressive MS Alliance is and what role the Scientific Steering Committee plays?
So I suppose I should begin by saying that progressive MS is one of the areas within MS which has really had very little attention over the years, and we all felt that it was an area that needed focus, and we needed to bring people together to try and look for treatments for progressive MS, and that was really what started the Alliance off. The Alliance came from the MS societies across the world who identified that we needed to do much more in this area than we had been doing. So the International Progressive MS Alliance was set up, and part of that was to establish a scientific steering committee of scientists, clinical scientists from around the world who would guide the Alliance, who would identify what the key challenges and problems were and would help to solve them.
The creation of the Alliance represents a somewhat unique approach to solving the riddle of progressive MS. In what ways has the Alliance been able to impact or influence efforts to better understand or treat this disease?
Well, I think the Alliance is quite unique in the world of MS because all of the societies truly work together. They put their grants together, their assessments are done. So it's a great model, and in fact, if you really want to overcome something, you do need to bring everybody together to try and do that. I would say that in the 5 years since the Alliance has started, we have seen an extraordinary rise in the profile of progressive MS. It is now centre stage. It is now an area that people want to get involved in, want to do research in, and want to identify treatments in. I think the Alliance has also funded some really interesting, innovative and early research, which has helped to get many more people involved in the area. And the biggest thing, I suppose, is that it has funded 3 major international networks which are looking at identifying outcomes that we can use in trials and in following up people with progressive MS, but also in identifying new targets and therefore new treatments for progressive MS.
As we speak, I think there are about 14 different drug therapies for relapsing remitting MS, and one drug therapy that's been recently approved in some places for progressive MS and is still gaining approval in other areas of the world. Why is there such a disparity in treatment options between relapsing remitting and progressive MS?
Well, this discrepancy points to the real challenge of progressive MS, which is that we don't understand the mechanisms that cause progression as clearly as we do the mechanisms in relapsing remitting MS. So if you don't understand the mechanisms, it's very hard to identify targets for treatment. And one of the key aims of the Alliance is to improve our understanding of the mechanisms so that we can then go on and identify targets. It's wonderful that we now have a drug becoming available internationally, and it's the first, but it has to be the first of many. And this, we really need to see a very effective treatments in progressive MS.
Earlier, you had mentioned the 3 major studies that have been funded by the Alliance and are currently in process around the world. What do you see as the next steps for the Alliance?
Well, that's a very good question, because that's exactly what we are in the throes of discussing now. We need to move the alliance onto a higher level, if you like, so that it has more influence and drives the research agenda more effectively. We now have a considerable profile, and I think we can do that much better than 3 or 4 years ago. So now we need to think about what are the key things we want to do. We still need to get a better understanding of progression. We need to gather all the data from the clinical trials together and look at that very carefully to see what new insights we can learn about progressive MS that can then be translated into new targets and subsequently new treatments. We want to do more work around the so-called biomarker area, that is imaging or proteins in the blood or the spinal fluid that will help us to tell us what's happening with the condition. And we particularly want to do much more in the areas of rehabilitation and managing symptoms. This is a really challenging area, but incredibly important for everybody with MS, and that's another real focus for the Alliance going forward.
Well, sounds like the Alliance has its plate very, very full, and I think we're all very happy to see that and hear that. So I just want to thank you for your time, and I appreciate you joining us today.
It's a real pleasure, John, and it's been a pleasure having you on the Scientific Steering Committee.
Thanks. That's going to wrap it up for this week's episode of RealTalk MS. I want to thank everybody who's taken the time to send me an email. I always appreciate your feedback and your suggestions. Don't forget, you can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Google Play Music, or Stitcher. And if you have a minute, I'd appreciate it if you head over to iTunes and give our podcast a rating and a review. My name is John Strum. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.